Hello everybody. Today I'm going to be going through a process of an illustration, Tails the Detective. Now with any illustration, I start by doing some rough sort of thumbnails, mostly of the pose, but also like somewhat the facial expression. I want to do a sort of detective pose, so I'm gonna try a couple of things. In the second one, I wasn't super into trying anything else, but I thought it would be cute for him to go like, oh my goodness. Have a more floaty pose as well, to go in more in line with the other ones I've done in this style. But in the end, I feel like I was most happy with the first pose that I worked out. I felt like it was too samey with the poet I've done in this series. So I will be going for that first one that I've sketched. Just wanted to make sure I got all my ideas out first, but now that I know which one I want to do, just quickly erase these other ones. While I'm sketching it bigger, I do like to keep that original thumbnail in the corner, just to give me an idea of like the roughest shapes and everything, because I often do quite like the look of my small sketches. They're quite cute and very expressive. So I build up the shape of his body, and this is where a lot of the framing happens. So if I don't like where something's sitting on the page, now's the best time to change it around, rotate things, resize things. And I do start with a square for Tails' head. It helps a lot with his ear placement. And as you can see, it's all very rough at this stage. I didn't quite leave enough room for the size of his tails. I wanted to make them a bit bigger, so I need to do a bit of reframing here, but I'm just trying to get the big shapes in right now. And then the cape, I just sketched in quickly, because there is something I want to do with that when I get to lining. And in lining, just testing out a few brushes here. I didn't like this brush, it's a bit too rough. And then this one is the custom free G pen. I used that one for my comic actually, but I want it to be a bit smoother, so I'm going for a smooth brush for this one. That one's much better. It is smooth, it just doesn't look good. So I start by doing some lines. I'm not too worried about getting them super tapered or anything. I kind of want the shading to be the star of this piece. And I'm using a lot of points in the curves. I just really like the look of points on curves. Really helps something look more graphic. And I really like to emphasize the black around the eyes in these characters. I guess it's sort of like their eyelashes. And I'm making sure that his tufts have that same sort of pointed curve to them. The expression I wanted to go for was sort of like a cunning, sort of coy look. Like he knows something's up. And this hand, I wasn't quite happy with, so I made it a little bigger. I wanted to do that first, so it's good to change the size of things as early as you can, so that you're not interrupting too much of the piece. And this cape, I started off drawing it quite sharp at the corners, but then I remembered I want it to look like it has quite a bit of volume. So I made sure to round out those corners and those edges. And I'm trying to make the creases very broad to show the weight of the garment, because when something's thick like wool, it tends to hold its shape a lot better, so the creases are a lot wider and broader. And I also added some volume to the collar piece as well. Most of the creases would come from the sheer weight of it rather than how it reacts to the body that's wearing it. And Tails' gloves are very, very big, so I made sure to make them extra baggy. And I like to give the hands a lot of softness and roundness when I draw them. Just adds to the cartooniness of their proportions, to have their hands be very large and cartoony as well. And for the shoes, I wanted to give him some nice dress shoes, because they fit better with the costume overall. I didn't change too much about this outfit, I kept it mostly how it was, but I wanted to give him some new shoes. And I like drawing dress shoes. And his tails, I made them nice and big and fluffy. Big shapes. I was trying to make them a little finer, but the rest of the image is quite big and rounded, so I thought I'd keep it the same. For details like the magnifying glass that I want to sit on top of everything else, I like to actually start a new layer and then draw all those details on that new layer. And that way I can go underneath whatever I've drawn on this new layer and easily erase anything that overlaps. It helps with lining things up for me, because oftentimes if I'm drawing around a shape like this, it's harder to line things up. But that way it also helps when I'm colouring. And here I've started colouring. I'm just going to be doing that technique where you fill everything in. It gives you more of a help with harmonizing all the colors together, especially when it comes to the whites, because whites can be quite stark. Just filling all the whites in here, all the little white spaces that we don't want to see. I like to use a nice bold golden color for tails, because I feel yellow is a bit too generic looking, and I use a nice off-white, nice creamy off-white. It gives it more of an old-fashioned feel, and this game definitely had a nice warm palette to it. It took me a few tries to get the colour of the cape right, and I'm not actually done here. I think I just gave up for a second, but I'll get back to it in a second. I'm just colouring in his little bands that keep his gloves on. A lot of the browns can be quite difficult for me to pick first off, but I fix them later. And yeah, that's that brown that I liked. I changed it to a much nicer desaturated brown. And I'm changing the image size so the canvas is a nicer frame. And I'm filling that magnifying glass in with the very top layer with I believe I used a screen layer in the end. I like using screen for glass. And now I'm using a bubble pen here. It really helps with shoelaces, because shoelaces can be very fiddly otherwise. For shading, I actually used my reference color that I shaded everything in. And I'm using clipping layers for all these color layers, so that nothing falls out of the bounds of the figure. And using a nice brown color to shade this, it gives it that really rustic look, I find. It's very old paper or something like that. Sort of smoky, like an old detective's office. I find it quite difficult sometimes to place shading, so the easiest thing to do, I find, is to make the shapes as big as possible, rather than trying to make tiny little shapes for every single detail. Shading usually is in large chunks like this anyway. It's usually the way shadows look. I'm just trying to keep in mind the volume of what I have here. And then I'm going to go in with a cooler, less saturated brown, just to go in the very depths of the shadows with an airbrush. I have this layer pixels locked, so it's just on top of the pixels I've already put down. And then I go in with a more warm color, and I'm just shading where the light's coming in, where the shadows would warm up a little, just to give it a nice temperature and gradient. Gives the shading a little bit more interest than just having a flat color. And this is like an easy way to make your shading look better if it's a little dodgy, like mine often is. And now I'm just going in with some highlights. I like to use a really nice saturated color for highlights, because I'm going to be lightening this up a lot as well and reducing the opacity. This is still on a normal layer. It's a lot easier to see where the lighting is. And I tried to keep some of the edges a little free from the light to give it a bit more volume, but other places I just left the lighting right to the edge, where I think it would look best. And I try not to add too much highlights to furred characters. It can make them look a little too smooth, but just on the highest points of the face is good. And making the buttons nice and shiny is always fun. And even though this isn't a super glossy material, the way light hits wool sometimes, it can give it a bit of a sheen, especially with all the fibers. And I like to think of lighting in this case more like where the light is hitting rather than having a reflection or a shine. This is obviously a very clean looking highlight, but I do go back and duplicate this layer and then add a blur. And now I'm just trying to add some temperature to the colours here. I did some with the shading, but I felt it needed a bit more interest. I've changed it to a bit of a purpley colour. It just makes it feel a lot more cool and dark. Change that layer to add glow. That's my favourite kind of lightning effect. And I duplicated it and then blurred the duplicated layer. And then I just give it a few adjustments to make sure it's how I like it. A lot of changes in opacity, and then I actually do go in and erase some of the edges. Just add a bit more of a gradient to where the lighting would be a bit weaker, especially where there's more shading and the side of the figure that hasn't got a light source. But I like to keep those strong highlights of the eyes, because the eyes, for me, are the most important part of the face. Adding that blurred edge to lighting, it really helps it have a sort of bloom effect. And then I'm going in with these lines for the cape. I like to curve them a little bit where the creases are. Gives it a sense that it's actually on the cape and it's not just a texture that's been placed on top. I do that sometimes, but I wanted to give this one a little bit more detail and attention. And you can see where the lines are a lot more curved. I'm just adding a bit extra warmth to the face and to the magnifying glass. I wanted to make that a little cooler because it was starting to get a bit too warm for me. And now for the background, I wanted to do a sort of parchmenty colour, some red boxes for a nice pop of colour, and I did a bit of weathering with a rough wash brush, because having just a stark colour wouldn't be very interesting. And then I used that same large brush to add some texture to the background. I like to layer different tones and different values, and then I'll duplicate all I did to the background and then use it as an overlay layer over the whole image to give that same texture to the picture. It won't sink too much into the background, but it does give it a bit more harmony and a bit more interest when you look up close and you see that nice watercolor texture. And I wanted to also add some nice framing, so I found a nice blood splatter pen because it's a murder mystery. And of course, I had to add his title right at the bottom, The Detective. It took me a second to figure out if I wanted it bold or not, but in the end, I made the right decision. And there we go. I hope you guys like this one.